Hello, team. Welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pierce. This is a Ukraine war, I guess, kind of an extra. I wasn't planning on giving this presentation. I was going through some comments this morning on my YouTube threads, as I normally do when I wake up, do my research, and I was having this conversation with someone who was presenting the case that, and someone who broadly supports Ukraine, has a particular stance as an American voter, and is saying that, yeah, Ukraine should be going to the elections. Look, we did it in the Civil War, and the US, and so on and so forth. And I'll present some of those points because actually I'll use it as stimulus, as a route into this discussion. This is an important discussion, I think, and there are arguments going both ways in it, but I think one side has arguments that are much stronger, and it's concerning, whether there should be an election, a presidential, parliamentary election in Ukraine. And it's been an argument that has been going on for some time, and there has been pressure at a few points to entertain the idea from outside entities, but nothing too formal. I think Austria is the only country that has said formally that Ukraine should carry out elections. So we're going to look at that subject. It's quite a niche subject. I'm doing it live because it enables me to show my presentation whilst also going and looking at other sources as well if I need to. Get your questions and feedback too. But it's just a little bit lazy. I would have done this as a pre-record, but I would have had to chop and change and actually stitch it all together and use different sources, and it's just a bit of a nightmare given I'm using a PowerPoint. Now, I'm going to tell you that my PowerPoint presentation isn't all singing, all dancing. All the animations on it are taken off when it gets uploaded to this program that you're watching everything on now through YouTube. So it won't have whizzy graphics and stuff that it would otherwise have that I've put in there. And also, it is quite a boring presentation, but there aren't many pictures. There's a lot of text. It's mainly for me, so I can give you that information. So it is death by PowerPoint. That is what it is. Get over it type thing. Sorry about that. Also, I whacked the PowerPoint together in like an hour and a half tops. So this is the most hastily produced presentation. But I just wanted to get the content out there for you guys. I mean, already Vigo says, should Ukraine hold an election? No. End of conversation. Okay, well, let's look at some of the arguments then concerning this topic. And here we go. So should Ukraine hold elections? If there are any typos on this presentation, I am solely responsible for that. I'm going to make this go on big full screen for me. So when I'm hoping JR is going to come in, if there are any questions, he might look at moderating the questions to help me, but I might not be able to see he's there because I'm going to full screen this. Right. Okay. So we're going to start by looking at a couple of people talking about elections here. So in Ukraine, Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene, who's obviously a very divisive political character in the US, says Zelensky is now a dictator in Ukraine since his term officially expired yesterday and he cancelled elections. Of course, he didn't cancel elections, and we're going to talk about that. So that's disinformation, I would argue. This is not democracy, and American taxpayers should not be forced to fund Ukraine's government. Ukraine's government $1 billion per month and nearly $200 billion for a war they can't win. Of course, we can argue about how much they have funded and how much of that funding goes back into the US economy, etc., etc. Right, now let's look at what one of the commenters on my thread has said. And remember, this guy is someone who supports Ukraine, but does have some views that I disagree with politically, particularly concerning American politics. Anyway, so he says, it doesn't matter how hard it is, it's what democracies are supposed to do, regardless of whether their population wants elections or the optics or not. The optics to the rest of the world are bad. So if you don't have elections, these are bad optics for the rest of the world. We will look at some of these arguments. And indeed, is it what democracies are supposed to do? There's an element that just the day of voting is not the whole of what democracies do in terms of the whole democratic process. And you want free and fair elections. It's not just about a voting day. And so we'll talk about that point as well. And he says you're kind of actually making Marjorie Taylor Greene's point for her. If it's against Ukraine's law to have elections when things get tough, then the US really needs to consider whether that is a country or system of government worth supporting. So here's someone who otherwise supports Ukraine, says actually, if they're not going to hold an election, I don't think it's worth supporting them, especially if we are going to start calling them partners or anything else beyond the enemy of my enemy. So there's a little bit of stimulus to get involved in there. The other comment replying to me, and I just find is useful for having some as I say, some stimulus, something to discuss. He says, I couldn't care less about being right or wrong. Okay, whatever. I'm just trying to let you know that her position on this particular topic is a relatively mainstream view here in the US, because the idea of cancelling elections or postponing them is foreign to us. I don't know that I don't know that this is a mainstream view. That I don't think there's any polling on the position of Ukrainian elections that he's drawing from. I know the UK didn't have them for 10 years. We're going to talk about this. That's the point. And one of the many reasons why so many Americans are Eurosceptical, I don't think that's true, and find lectures about democracy and authoritarianism from Europeans laughable. Again, I don't think that's true. Any democracy that can put off elections whenever it becomes inconvenient is hardly a democracy at all. And of course, we'll talk about, how far inconvenience goes here. And I'd say it's more than just being an inconvenience. As not to belittle Britain either, as you're clearly a cut above the rest of Europe on topics like these, which further highlights the point, so on and so forth. So this is the standard we are talking about. So he talks about the US holding elections during the Civil War, and we're going to mention this, while half the country was occupied in rebellion, and many of the congressional delegates being elected actively wanted to give the South their nationhood. That is a standard we are talking about, realizing that elections are even more important because of the war instead of looking for excuses. If the people want Zelensky and his government, then he should welcome elections anyways to provide himself more legitimacy. Okay, so that's where we're at in terms of some of the arguments. Why I wanted to do this presentation, because I was reading these and I was like, okay, as I'm reacting to these and giving you arguments back, what's the point of doing all this? I might as well put it together in a presentation and deliver it to you guys so it can be of use. This is one of these videos I'm going to do, which is hopefully a little bit more evergreen than my normal daily news videos. So we're going to start with the idea of the US and UK elections that have been referenced here. So the idea is that for that Civil War election of 1864 that he's talking about, as you can see from the infographic on the right, not many states actually voted. In fact, there were, I think, only 25 states voted in that election, which is highly controversial, right? So if you're talking about holding, well, look at the US, look at what the US has done, and Ukraine should do this. We've got a problem because actually you don't have the representation of the whole country. Indeed, there was the issue of succession, which is different from what we have here, which is invasion, not succession. Also, you didn't have black people voting until the 14th and 15th Amendments came around, and that was fairly difficult to implement. You didn't have women voting at the time. So I think it's completely unfair to say, well, look, we held elections in the Civil War, and therefore Ukraine can, when it's actually comparing apples to bricks, I would argue. And the UK didn't hold elections, I think, from 1935 to 1945, because the Second World War came along when there were due elections, went into war. And that was completely accepted by the general public. And it was not even a war that was taking place on UK soil, right? Ukraine has been invaded. And we didn't have an election for 10 years because of World War II. So let's read a quote here from an Atlantic Council piece that I think is really good here. And it says Zelensky should say a Churchillian no to wartime elections elections in Ukraine. That's written by the Atlantic Council. So Churchill's reasons for doing so were obvious and in many ways apply equally to today's Ukraine. In 1940, Britain sought to avoid the distraction and potentially divisive impact of elections in order to maintain national resilience and focus all its energy on the war. The Churchill government also recognized the impracticality of holding an election with millions of displaced people across and beyond the nation. We're going to talk about that a lot later, and saw that it would be virtually impossible to ensure a fair test of public opinion with Britain under daily attack and engaged in a global war. The piece then goes on, and I think this really underscores a lot of the issue with the Ukrainian election, or the potential to have one. So what happened with Churchill is that there weren't elections for the entirety of the war, but actually everyone was on board with this, and we'll return to this idea as it pertains to Ukraine. But essentially, everyone was on board with this in the UK, and the idea is this lack of debate is underlined by the fact that Hansard, the British record of parliamentary debates, appears to record only one instance of Prime Minister Winston Churchill being asked about postponed elections in the course of the entire war. The pressing and obvious need to extend the life of the existing parliament until the defeat of Nazi Germany was clear to everyone. Ukrainians can draw a number of lessons from past British practice during their own war of national survival. Notably, British politicians during World War II recognized that organizing elections amid a major war is likely to imperil the objective of victory, something we're going to return to. This was so self-evident to the British of the early 1940s that Parliament hardly saw the need to discuss each of the 5 annual prolongation bills tabled by the Churchill government. It is also worth underlining that nobody attempted to criticize Britain's position on wartime elections as anti-democratic, either at the time or in subsequent decades. So that's, I think, outside of the UK and within the UK. This was just, it's obvious that we're not going to hold elections. It's impractical. It imperils our society and those who are who are potentially going to be voting, etc., and we have people all over the shop fighting in wars around the globe, etc. Okay, when a country is engaged in a war, it says, of national survival, the top priorities must be the prosecution of the war with maximum vigor and the maintenance of national unity. Any attempt to stage elections in today's Ukraine would almost certainly distract from these 2 objectives. Crucially, millions of Ukrainians would be excluded from any wartime voting, while the authorities cannot possibly guarantee the safety of those who would theoretically be able to participate. The utter impracticality of holding elections in wartime Ukraine would have been immediately apparent to Churchill and others from this era. Unfortunately, some Westerners from today's far more comfortable generation do not appear to understand the terrible reality that Ukraine now lives with. Okay, so that gives you a bit of background. I just wanted to answer the UK-US election thing, and there's lots more that can be said about that, but I really want to go to actually considering the arguments for and against Ukraine in particular holding an election. So the arguments for holding the presidential elections in Ukraine are really quite simple. That's not to say they're not powerful. That's not to say they don't have force, but there aren't many of them, and they're fairly obvious, which is, well, democracy in general, right? Democracy is a good thing, so the more of it you can have, that's good. So that reflects the will of the people. The idea here, what is the point of democracy? It's that you are politically represented, or the will of the people is being politically represented. This is a massive point we're going to come back to, because actually the polls suggest that the people don't want an election. So that is in itself democracy, if you're reflecting the will of the people. Now, that hasn't been put to a vote, and it is just polling, but nonetheless. So anyway, it would be democratic. Of course it would. It would also prove to the world that they are striving for democratic ideals, and that includes proving to Putin that Ukraine is democratic. And it adds, by not doing it, you are giving ammunition to people like Marjorie Taylor Greene, to disinformation campaigns that that I think are an issue for Ukraine. This is, you're giving grist to the mill, to the Russian disinformation mill, and that is certainly unfortunate. So to continue, though, And by the way, that's the end of the arguments for. There may be other arguments for, but I'm not seeing them. It is just basically the ability to do democracy and to have the will of the people reflected in governance. Okay, so now we're going to look at arguments against Ukraine holding presidential elections. And I know I am favouring them not holding them, and I'm going to give you the arguments against, and I'm going to spend a lot more time on them than the arguments for. So you could argue that you can possibly posit that I am being somewhat biased in the way that I'm presenting it, because I've given you the arguments for, and I've finished with them already. So, but you know, it's fairly simple. It's democracy, right? And you should have it. And by not having it, you're going to shoot yourself in the foot. Now, the arguments against are very wide ranging, and each of these I will present a whole bunch of nuance to them and different elements that go into all of these points. So these themselves represent many other points. But one, it's unconstitutional. Two, it reflects the will of the people. Not holding elections, oddly, reflects the will of the people. Three, it reflects the will of the political parties. Four, it reflects the will of the leading elections and human rights organizations. Five, the expenses of carrying out such an election at a time of war. Six, it undermines national security itself and national unity. Sorry, that's not security, national unity. And then the last two, practicalities. There are so many issues with practicalities. That's one of those ones that will have lots of points to it. And also, it makes it effectively a mock election. If they were to hold an election, it would not be a free and fair election. And this is really, really important. And again, we'll talk about this in more depth. But it will effectively be a pretend election, essentially. That it won't do the job of being a really decent, free and fair election. And that will, with it, allow for certain players in the election to have greater advantage in the election. It might even really heavily favour the ruling party anyway. So the first point we're going to look at is that it is unconstitutional. And now I could go into showing you, and in fact, what I might do is take you to this. I think I will. As you can see there, the Wikipedia entry says that scholars have stated that the Ukrainian constitution does not hold national elections, while martial law is in effect. The 2023 Ukrainian parliamentary election were not held, and the 2024 Ukrainian presidential election also did not take place on its scheduled date of 31st of March 2024. Okay, so scholars agree. That's a bit of a mere assertion, though. So we can go and have a look at something from, I think it's Oporo, which is a civic institution or civic organization in Ukraine, and legal information on the impossibility of holding elections under conditions of martial law. So with the approach of constitutionally established period for scheduling the parliamentary and presidential elections, the debate on the possibility of conduct of elections under conditions of martial law is heating up both in Ukraine and among our international partners. So the basic foundation here is that Parliament has, and they keep extending this, have voted in martial law, and they're under martial law because they are being invaded and they're at war. And being at war, you have to be able to do certain things that you wouldn't be able to do normally in your everyday kind of democratic landscape. You need to have powers that you can do things quickly and without too much dilly-dallying with, should we get this to the vote and have everyone vote on it? No, martial law means that we're at war and we need to do some stuff really quickly. And it might seem like quite harshly, but this is actually to protect the nation and in the best interests of the nation. So Civic Network Opora and more than 200 other NGOs have already taken a stand against the proposal to hold elections during a Russian invasion. That's an argument we're going to come back to later as well. According to Civic Network Opora, conduct of election under martial law violates the constitution of Ukraine and runs counter to Ukraine's international commitments. So they start off, this article starts off with looking at the international elements here and talking about, human rights and whether, not holding election is actually in line with international law rather than going against prevailing international law. And they say it's actually in line with international law. We're just going to join it concerning the constitutional aspect to Ukrainian the Ukrainian political situation, which is to say that the Constitution declares Ukraine a democratic state, Article 1, which places our country under an obligation to comply with generally recognized standards and principles of holding elections enshrined in Chapter 3, elections referendum, despite the imposition of martial law. At the same time, according to the Constitutional Court decision number 3, dated July the 11th, 1997, the principles of the constitutional system of Ukraine are enshrined in Chapters 1, 3, and 13 of the Basic Law, subclause 4 and clause 1 of reasoning of the court decision. Okay, this chapter of the Constitution is specially protected from changes. It can be amended only by the case of carrying out a complicated procedure, including mandatory approval of changes through an all-Ukrainian referendum, which is impossible under conditions of martial law. Article 64 of the Constitution of Ukraine confirms that the right to participate in the management of state affairs, including the right to freely elect and be elected to bodies of state power and bodies of local self-government, provided it for in Article 38, as well as the right of freedom of opinion and expression, Article 34, and right of freedom of association, Article 36, and right of peaceful assembly, Article 39, are not absolute and may be restricted under conditions of martial law. Such restrictions naturally stem from the impossibility of complying with the requirements provided in Chapter 3 of the Constitution of Ukraine, including those provided for in Article 71, which stipulates that the elections of two bodies of state power and bodies of local self-government are free and shall be held on the basis of universal, equal, and direct suffrage by way of secret ballot. In other words, that when you have, I mean, the key is, as mentioned, martial law, and it goes on to talk about other paragraph 2, Article 74, basic law emphasizes the need to guarantee the free expression and will of voters, which you can't very easily do under martial law. In this regard, the Constitutional Court of Ukraine underscored that the principle of free elections is implemented through the following key components: guaranteeing the voters' right to freely form and express their views and opinions, which you can't do under martial law because you have freedom of speech impingements, objective and accurate official certification of election results, devoid of falsifications, recognition of election results, and respect for the democratic choice of the Ukrainian citizens. The entire electoral process should be organized and carried out in such a way to ensure unhindered expression of the will of voters in respect to election results, so on and so forth. And it goes further. I mean, I could read all of this. It's worth emphasizing that requirements provided for in Chapter 3 of the Constitution of Ukraine apply to all types of elections, meaning that it is mandatory for both national and local elections to comply with these requirements. The prohibition to hold elections under conditions of martial law is also pursuant to paragraph 4 of Article 83 of the Constitution of Ukraine, which doesn't allow for termination of the authorities of the Verkhovna Rada, the Ukrainian parliament, and automatically extends the term of parliamentary powers until the election of new convocation of parliament after the end of the war. Quote, in the event that the term of authority of the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine expires while a state of martial law or of emergency is in effect, its power shall be extended until the day when the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine, elected after the cancellation of the state of martial law or of emergency, convenes its first meeting of the first session. The opponents emphasize that there are no similar requirements for extending the term of presidential powers. Paragraph 1 of Article 108 of the Constitution stipulates that the president of Ukraine shall exercise his or her authority until the assumption of office by the newly elected president of Ukraine. However, given the impossibility of electing the members of parliament as a national representative body, conduct of election of the president of Ukraine would result in implementation of different approaches to forming the presidential and legislative branches of power, while the nature and principles of holding elections are the same for both of these bodies of state power. And so on and so forth. Basically, you have this situation, because I don't want to just spend the whole time reading to you. You have a situation where it is constitutionally written in that in the situation where you have martial law in place, you cannot properly hold elections, and it's within the Constitution that elections shouldn't be held until martial law is over. So therefore, to conclude, conduct of elections under conditions of martial law and full-scale aggression violates the principles of electoral law. So it's not only that, but it's the fact that you can't all the components of running an election are impossible given the situation of being at war. And so all of those things, including the international stipulations, international legal stipulations, but also written into Ukrainian constitution of how you should run an election, a free and fair election, are invalidated by being under martial law. So um, violates the principle of electoral law. First of all, the principle of free elections and international standards, given that the fact that security risks, restriction of freedom of expression, and prohibition of peaceful assemblies make it impossible to ensure free political competition, and as a consequence, free formation and expression of the will in wartime. So it is agreed upon that that Ukraine's constitution does not allow for presidential elections and parliamentary elections to take place. So that is really important. So it's not like, and this goes back to what Marjorie Taylor Greene claimed, is that Zelensky cancelled elections. It's not like there were elections due, which they were due, but he went, do you know what, sod that, I'm president, I'm going to be in power for longer, I'm going to cancel elections. Is that constitutionally you can't have elections under martial law. And so therefore, in order for there to be elections, you need to not be at war and not have martial law. So there we go. And of course, this is particularly poignant today because the UK has just announced that we are going to have a general election in July. So I think that's quite the coincidence. Right. So the next argument is, and this goes back to the idea that democracy reflects the will of the people, but actually, and this is only a poll, right? So this isn't like legally binding, and there might be issues with the poll, and you need to make sure that this genuinely is a reflection of what the people think. But about 81% of the people in Ukraine in August of last year, I think that's the last time I can find data for, believe that there should not be elections. So if you're saying that, well, democracy is about reflecting the will of the people, and if this is at least to some extent the will of the people, then essentially the will of the people is not to have a democratic reflection of the will of the people just yet, right? So actually, the people themselves want there not to be elections at the moment by a fairly staggering majority. And I think that is super, super important. As you can see here, however, most Ukrainians support the decision to postpone the elections. In the autumn of 2023, the Kyiv International Institute of Sociology surveyed Ukrainians on the feasibility of holding elections in Ukraine according to their schedule. 81% of respondents voted that elections should be held after the war. So there is that. Then you have, it reflects the will of the parties, i.e. not holding elections reflects the will of the parties. All of the parties, they all agreed that they shouldn't have wars. Ukrainian parliament's opposition leaders signed a joint statement that both parliamentary and presidential elections should take place after the cessation of the war and the conclusion of martial law. The document indicates a consensus among major political parties regarding the need for an appropriate period of time to prepare for elections and favorable conditions for campaigning and voting. Because at the end of the day, and we're going to come on to this, voting isn't just about, or elections aren't just about the day of voting. It's not, it's about campaigning. It's about whether you have the ability to say what you want. So can you denigrate the president under martial law? Can you talk about things that are really pertinent to getting voted in if there are certain things you're not allowed to talk about due to operational security? Can everyone say what they like? Does everyone have free and fair access to the mechanisms of campaigning, of fundraising, etc., etc.? And so you would not be able to have a free and fair election, but we'll come to that a bit later. Okay, not only does it reflect the will of the people not to have elections and the will of the parties, all the parties, but it also reflects the will of the election and human rights CSOs, so organizations around the world, all the major ones. The opinion is supported by over 100 leading election and human rights organizations, which in a joint statement emphasize the impossibility of holding elections during the active war phase. The statement urges international partners to increase support for Ukraine to finally conclude the war, making democratic elections feasible at least 6 months after the end of martial law. Ukraine is a democracy at war. It needs to deal with the external threat and then to hold elections. As Olga Ivazovska, head of the board of the civil network Opora that we just referred to, and an expert on elections, rightly stresses, Ukraine has a record of hewing to a high standard for free and fair elections, but it is impossible to adhere to that standard in wartime. And that's from the Wilson Center piece, Wartime Ukraine's Election Dilemma. In other words, that if you want free, if Ukrainians are aspiring to free and fair elections to deliver the very best democracy for their country, then holding elections during a wartime will not allow them to achieve those high aspirations. So just postpone it until they can do proper elections. Okay, the next argument is it's just a massive distraction from the war. As we heard earlier, the Churchillian approach is that, we need to commit to the war with all our vigor. We need to unite together to fight for a common goal of winning a war, right? And that's what Ukraine need to do. And this is both a distraction from the war for the electorate and for Zelensky himself. And you could argue all the politicians. So Zelensky would have to direct thought, time, resources, effort to campaigning and organizing elections. All of that thought and time and energy would be misdirected. It would be directed away from trying to win the war. He wouldn't be going to other countries to, in order to drum up support for the war. He wouldn't be going to get Patriot systems from another country with his persuasiveness that we know is so effective. Instead, he would be campaigning in his own country to his own domestic audience to try and get voted in. Is that the best use of his time? Is that the best use of all the other people involved in that campaign, those campaigns, and the electoral process and the administration of the election? Should they be committing to the war, to supporting the war, building drones rather than erecting polling booths? He needs to be organizing the defense of his country, and so do all of the politicians. And this is arguably not the optimal use of their time and resources and money. It is a distraction. Likewise, a distraction for the country seeking to defend the country itself. They need to organize their own society for the purpose of prevailing in the war. So that's that argument. Then we get on to the expense in wartime. So as just a benchmark, it's interesting to note that the US 2020 presidential election cost about $4 billion, not $4, $4 billion to administer. Otherwise, it'd be a very cheap election. According to the Central Election Committee's 2023 calculations, the presidential elections in Ukraine are estimated to cost $196.7 million, while the parliamentary elections may require approximately $135.9 million. Of course, all of that money need not be spent. And of course, that's not to talk about the time, like we said, the time and other resources that would be committed to administering. That's just the administration of the election. Think of how much military equipment that money could buy. At the same time, Ukraine's 2024 budget anticipates $43.7 billion in reserves, but almost twice that, $82.3 billion in expenditures, in revenues, without including election costs. So it's just going to add to an already very precarious financial position. Zelensky has said himself he does not want to take money from weapons and give it to elections. That's the calculation he sees it, and I see it like that as well. Is money better spent on defending the country from invasion? I would argue yes. And you could argue that, again, sorry, some typos here. I did type this up very, very quickly. Allied financing could overcome that. You could say, well, okay, but the US or the EU or allied nations could come together and finance that. But then again, that's money they could be putting towards financing weapons rather than elections. And so you're still robbing Peter to pay Paul, and actually Peter's the one that's going out fighting. I think it's a real opportunity cost by not funding the war to that tune. Campaign funds should be better spent on the war, right? And yeah, by the way, that's just the cost of administration, not the cost of funding campaigns. So each of those political parties and each of those political opponents will be funding their campaign to try and get elected. And all of that money goes on top of the administration costs. So that is money that is frittered away on an election. I wouldn't normally call it frittered if it was a peacetime election, but here I think that is money that is unwisely spent. And I would argue it undermines national unity here. And that is really, really important. So just to get a page, I can read it elsewhere, because I do also want to see whether there are some questions I need to answer. I know that JR is starring some of your questions for me. And I know many of these questions will be answered in the presentation I give. Russian online disinformation will be chomping at the bit for an election to interfere with. Propaganda bonanza. Press like this is a good point that I'll be coming to later. So anyway, it undermines national unity. So this is from a statement against holding elections in Ukraine during the war, the Reanimation Package of Reforms Coalition. So a coalition that brought out a statement saying, I think it's a cross-party coalition. Here they said, holding elections in times of war can undermine national unity. So at the time when you want everyone to be fighting together, you're then inviting an election in that acts as divide. We know, goodness me, look at the US elections and how divisive they are. The Democrats and Republicans are at each other's throats. That is a time of most disunity in the American calendar, right? Same with the UK, same with any country. Elections, you have people fighting against each other. That's not what you want in a time of war. It will open up chasms that I think are very dangerous. So the disinformation disseminated by Russians, and this is exactly what was just said by Mr. Squiggle, the disinformation disseminated by Russians in Ukraine and globally will be aimed at undermining the credibility of the organizers and participants of the campaign to delegitimize the process and its results. A split in society can be provoked by real heroes fighting and risking their lives in times of war, while politicians cynically battle for power. Unless the military and volunteers can participate in the campaign as voters and candidates due to their daily priorities, this will cause internal confrontations and misunderstandings. And suppose Ukrainian citizens living abroad cannot exercise their right to vote or become candidates contributing to the post-war Ukraine's development program. In that case, this will provoke a split between refugees and locals. So again, that's a really interesting point about how divisive it will be. Not only just domestically in terms of the population living in Ukraine, how they'll be at each other, supporting different candidates and arguing against one another, but it could also advantage those living in Ukraine who aren't refugees, and refugees will then not be part of that process of the democratic process, but also rebuilding post-war democratically and elsewise. So I think some interesting points there. I'm going to take a swig from my tea. Sorry, not sorry. Okay, on to the next argument. Right, safety. This is incredibly important. And of course, safety should be paramount for any government, any activity that's obliged by the government. You don't want to be going and doing that and thinking, oh, the government's making me do this, or I'm obliged to do it as part of my civic duty. But actually, there's a really significant chance I'm going to die or get killed by a Russian missile targeting an election booth, so on and so forth. So, okay, let's look at this argument. So the safety issues raised, but it's not just that. The safety issues raised by a nationwide election campaign amid Russia's ongoing invasion are similarly immense, says the Atlantic Council. How could soldiers fighting on the front line effectively participate in a campaign? Can politicians hold public meetings or campaign rallies without fear of being targeted by Russian airstrikes? Aside from Kyiv, most Ukrainian cities have only limited air defenses. The prospect of holding any sort of public meeting in such conditions is fraught with danger. The many safety concerns related to campaign meetings would apply equally to polling stations on election day. A single Russian attack on a polling station during voting hours could easily result in dozens of deaths. Russia's track record of bombing civilian targets and public gatherings during the current war means that there can be little doubt that the Kremlin would seek to attack election-related events. It is also reasonable to question the wisdom of exposing the country to a period of intense internal political competition amid a war of national survival. How could national unity, and we just talked about that, be sustained throughout a 3-month election campaign? Clearly, technical innovations could be found to address some of these concerns. Perhaps Ukraine could deploy digital solutions for both campaigning and voting. Ultimately, however, these arguments against holding elections are compelling, if not overwhelming. Any attempt to organize Ukrainian elections in today's wartime conditions would be profoundly impractical and unsafe. Millions of refugees, displaced people, service personnel, and those living in Russian-occupied regions of Ukraine would be potentially unable to vote. It would amount to a dangerous as well as dubious exercise in democracy. And that's a very damning summary there. Just to go back, that again, when you're talking about, we could find ways around this, digital ways around this, all of that time, resources, and money spent on trying to find a way around this is of course, money, time, and resources that could be spent on defending the country at a time of war. But it's not just there. So we've got more on the safety front. The safety issues raised by nationwide election campaign and Russia's ongoing invasion are similarly immense. How could soldiers fighting on the front line? Oh no, we've gone for that. I'm reading the same bit. Sorry. To continue, this is not from the Atlantic Council. I was reading from one page there. This is from the Reanimation Package of Reforms Coalition. That statement again. Ukraine will face extreme security and operational challenges that cannot be overcome by any changes to the legislation. Destroyed infrastructure, the virtual impossibility of ensuring complete protection of all participants in the process, the need to ensure the right to vote for more than 7 million citizens displaced abroad and within the country, and more than 1 million defenders, so soldiers fighting in various places, the difficulty involving the police. So not only that, you've got the police then having to help with elections and not doing what the police would otherwise be doing. Part of the Ukrainian defense forces to protect the elections at a time of war, etc. Since around 20% of the country's territory is occupied or is in the scene of hostilities, another 20% is within the immediate reach of artillery installations, and missiles and drones are being launched across the country. This will create unprecedented and unjustifiable risks. Unjustified. Ukraine, actually, I'd say unjustifiable is a better word. Ukraine, as a country where human life and health are defined as the highest social values, cannot risk the lives of millions of its citizens when Russia is deliberately launching missile attacks and brutally killing civilians across the country. A possible massive missile attack on election day would make it impossible for citizens to access polling stations and disrupt the process. The inability to guarantee the outcome of the elections is a convenient tool for political pressure by the aggressor country. And we should not forget about the failure of people with disabilities, including veterans who were disabled during a war, to cast their votes in such conditions. So safety is definitely an element that needs to be taken into consideration. And now we have further practicalities, and my goodness, there are plenty of these. So let's just run through them. And these would fizz in on my PowerPoint with like wild abandon in amazing PowerPoint presentation skills, but alas, not today. So not only do we have to consider the cost, the administrative cost, and erecting voting booths, and how you get the cost it would that would be incurred in creating digital voting availability and whatnot. But just the practicality of all of this would be insanely difficult. And as mentioned already, very difficult. Voting booths, accumulations of people, very dangerous, as we mentioned. The Wilson Center says, with Russian military forces targeting civilian infrastructure, ensuring the safety of voters and election officials and observers is simply impossible. Okay. Then we have mitigation of that would then be costly. So you have further, in trying to get around the issues of safety, you incur further costs, and that would be resource intensive at the time of war, as mentioned. Right. Also, as mentioned, almost 20% of Ukraine's territory is occupied. Some settlements are entirely destroyed, while others lack the necessary infrastructure to enable voting. And then what about international election observers, putting them at risk as well? It's just incredibly difficult to update the list of voters. The voting practicalities of trying to get soldiers voting, refugees voting, of which there are over 8 million, 60% of whom are eligible to vote, and internally displaced people, at least 6 million there. So all of those people, the costs of getting that done, but also the sheer practicalities of trying to get those people to vote. And of course, you just wouldn't easily be able to get those people to vote. There'd be a huge issue of it being a free and fair election when it disadvantages and advantages certain elements of the population. And then you could have that it might turn out that people who are more likely to have stayed in Ukraine would favor one party over another. And it could be that people, I'm not necessarily saying this is the case, but you could get some kind of selection biases going on such that people who are more likely to be internally displaced, or a soldier, or a refugee, are more likely to vote for another party or candidate. And it could be that the ease of voting advantages certain demographics over others. And so it just becomes, there are these obstacles to a free and fair election. And then, of course, you've got the occupied regions. What do you do with that? The fact that Russia has invaded and taken over all these areas, and you would like them to be part of you'd like them to be part of the country. How do you deal with that? Um, it's so very difficult. Quote, and this is from the Wilson Center: Ukraine has learned the hard way that the essence of elections extends beyond the voting day. I think this is a really interesting point. It encompasses extended campaigns during which society can have honest debates on a range of divisive issues. To preserve national unity for a people facing existential threat is a life and death matter. Even antagonistic political forces are reluctant to gain office at the expense of losing the country. In other words, that voting isn't just about that day, it's about the whole process. And if that process is really badly affected by being at war, then you're really, you can have a day of elections, but it's a bit of a it's trying to polish a turd, isn't it? Like, you just, okay, well done, we've got this election day, but actually the whole process has been so fundamentally compromised by being at war that, when you do finally get the votes, well done, we're a democracy, but actually, does this really represent the will of the people? It's hugely problematic. And effectively, what happens then is you get a situation where the election isn't really an election, right? It's like a mock election. As an article or a journal entry in the International Politics and Society Journal, War Now, Elections Later, says, in the present circumstances, any balloting would effectively have been little more than a mock election. Moreover, it would have been overwhelmingly voluntarily ignored by the opposition, since standing for election in competition with the current supreme commander in the war against Russia would have been perceived negatively even by major Zelensky skeptics. Campaign fundraising, unfair, and little ability to do it. What I mean by that is that I think, first of all, campaign fundraising, as we've mentioned already, that money is going towards fundraising campaigns and not fundraising a defensive war. But also, you are possibly going to have advantages for certain people. So Zelensky will probably be conveyed a massive advantage. He controls the mechanisms of messaging, and this is not what you want: a free and fair election. He will definitely benefit from holding those elections during wartime, and he will no doubt use those mechanisms to his advantage, as naturally you probably would. And others may, just in general, the ability to fundraise may be really constrained and may advantage certain parties and candidates over others. This is from the Wilson Center. President Zelensky is not opposed to holding elections, but insists they must be held in accordance with the highest standards of democratic elections possible and should not detract from the country's national defense efforts. So in other words, we can hold elections, but they'll be really crap. They'll be like a really poor cousin to the kind of elections we are fighting for. We are moving towards this democratic ideal, and we can hold some half-assed elections that will bastardize our ideals. And I don't think that is what we should be doing. We should be postponing and waiting for the right moment to do things properly. Many Ukrainian civic organizations promoting free and fair elections agree on the need to hold elections only when the right conditions are present to ensure the integrity of the process and results. And I'd agree with that. Not the right conditions for free, fair, and representative elections, Teton. So there is that. We'll get to questions and observations after. There's not long left, but there's just some more on this idea that the elections won't be free and fair, and will be. In fact, I think I've only got 2 slides left, so I'll put you out of your misery soon. So, a quote from. Where are we? This is from that statement against holding elections in Ukraine during a war. So elections and full-scale war are incompatible. This idea is dangerous and will lead to the loss of legitimacy of both the process and the elected bodies, with a high probability of significant destabilization of the state as a whole. The key challenges are related to the free formation of political will in the active phase of the war, the inability to ensure full participation of the military and voters abroad, and the lack of political competition in the context of narrowing rights and freedoms under the martial law regime. So it's not just about the practicality, but the impact that these impracticalities will have on the free and fair and proper running of election. I just think about all those soldiers fighting in trenches, and they have to go and vote, and whether that is going to affect their performance in doing war and doing their job. Elections are not accessible if a competitive political contest is not possible during the war. And elections are not a dare voting, but a loud debate between different camps about the best program for the development of the state, as I previously mentioned. So there is that, and we're going to now come to really the last couple of points. And I think this is important. So if it's all about having an election day, some kind of show of election, like, okay, we're going to have this election and we're going to half-assedly do, that's not a word, do this thing, and yeah, you can't say what you want because of martial law, I can't say what I want because of martial law, but I get an advantage over you because I'm actually running these mechanisms, this and that, blah blah blah, blah, and all the things I've kind of hinted at. This starts to look a little bit like the elections taking place in Belarus and Russia. Now, Belarus and Russia have elections, right? Scare quotes, elections for those listening. Does not mean that they're democratic. So just having an election doesn't mean that you have a democracy, the kind of functioning democracy that you aspire to, as mentioned. So it's got to be the whole package. And then finally, martial law does not allow for, as mentioned, freedom of speech, and it does itself invalidate free and fair elections and information, access to free and fair information. So that's pretty much where I'm at with regard to the arguments against the election. And some of those that I've gone over quite quickly are big and require, a lot more weighting as opposed to other arguments that might have a lot of verbiage to them, but they might be sort of weaker arguments. But to reply to your man here at the beginning, where it's like, well, it's all about democracies. Well, if you're not a democracy, if you're not going to have elections, then you're not worthy of being a sort of partner to the US. I think is really problematic, because I don't know whether your man here has actually thought about all these arguments, whether he's taken them on board and cogitated over them. I mean, I've thought about these previously because I've made these arguments before at different points, actually probably about a year and a half ago now. And I just think if it was so obvious as your man here suggests, then you would have more people clamoring for elections. But as with Churchill and the UK not having an election right throughout the Second World War, and where virtually everyone, or indeed everyone, seemed to be fine with that, we have a situation here where the electorate, the politicians, and the electoral organizations and human rights organizations are fine with this. Like, if this was a massive problem, you would have lots of, as mentioned, clamoring for elections, but you're not really getting that. You're getting some pressure from outside because of some of these exterior opinions, and they could be driven by wanting Ukraine to fail, as in people pressuring from, say, the Austrian nation pressuring to Ukraine to have elections could be actually trying to get them into a position that disadvantages Ukraine in the war against Russia. Like, holding elections could be problematic for Ukraine on the battlefield, or to function as a society as effectively as possible in defending their nation in a war. And so it could be that the people asking for Ukraine to have elections are actually those who are on Russia's side, and those who are on Ukraine's side are generally cool with them not having elections. Yeah, Marjorie Taylor Greene, you can shut up because you don't really know what you're talking about. Here are the arguments. This is why I'm cool with them not having elections. So then the next question might be, well, okay, how long does this go on for? Like, is this always going to be the case? Well, if they're in a 20-year war, then you might have to sort something out before then. But as mentioned, the UK didn't have elections for 10 years. So they got to the end of the election cycle with due an election, and then, oops, the Second World War came along. And do you know what? We did fine out of that. Thank you very much. The nation pulled together, and there was bipartisan support for running the country. And I think what you'll get is bipartisan support in Verkhovna Rada for doing the right thing for Ukraine to prevail in the war. Everyone is going to be pulling together, you would hope, towards the common goal of Ukraine prevailing. Now, it might get to the point, if this war is going on in 3 years' time, that, do you know what? Yeah, we need to start thinking about how we can administer an election during a wartime. But I doubt it'll more likely be a frozen kind of conflict that is. I can't imagine it would be as hot as it is now in 3 years' time, but you never know. But I would certainly I do advocate Ukraine postponing the election for the time being, for all the arguments that I provided. Right. Let's get to some of your comments that JR has highlighted for me. Thanks, mate. Always alleged. So Cheryl here saying there are too many displaced people. Would be physically dangerous, unfair to combatants at the front who would not be physically able to vote. And yes, you can find ways around this, but it becomes difficult, it becomes costly, and as Cheryl mentions, it becomes dangerous. And I agree with that, absolutely. Rick from the Netherlands says many Ukrainians do not have the options to vote like in occupied territories, or voting is dangerous due to shelling. Exactly. Yep. It's the practicalities and the cost and the safety issue that is the most obvious obstacle to administering a successful election. I don't know what you do. Well, ideally, right, Ukraine gets back its borders to 1991 borders, and they welcome back those regions. I think that would be very difficult. I think Donbass particularly would be difficult. But you welcome back those regions, but you'd have to very carefully think about how you do an election, because you would have a lot of Russians that would still be living there. And I mean actual Russians who've been drafted in. If they haven't immediately sort of run out, if Ukraine managed to take back all its territory, you've got a very interesting scenario where you have people who are bad faith actors who aren't even technically Ukrainian living there. Like, it would just be a nightmare. They have to be really carefully thought through. Albertulo says Ukraine government spent a lot of time to build relations with other countries' representatives. If someone new came in now, all that work is lost, and a lot of information too. It just doesn't make sense. It's a really, really good point. That if and I don't know that Zelensky would get voted out. He's not as popular now as he was at the beginning of the war, but that's what's to be expected in a war that's lasted 2 years and struggling to shift gear in favor of Ukraine. That's completely to be expected. But if he was voted out, then Ukraine, that's a kick in the teeth, because those relationships he's built, those people he can phone, those world leaders that he can, as we understand with Boris Johnson when he was Prime Minister of the UK, apparently he was on WhatsApp with Zelensky. Zelensky could text him and say, dude, what do you think about this? We need your help here. And he has that relationship with certain leaders around the world. He has the busiest politician, I think, that has existed in the history of the world. He has been to so many places. He has a wealth of knowledge and expertise in how to handle different countries and different politicians and different regimes. And you would lose that. It just would be hugely counterproductive for Ukraine going forward. Richard RJK Spinningwood says, speaking of elections, JP, ours, UK has just announced, will take place on the 4th of July. I didn't know it's the 4th of July. And that's really interesting because that's at the front end of July. Oh, they are rushing that through. They must think that in order to get the biggest advantage in terms of votes for the Conservatives, they are putting that as soon as possible. Interesting. Anyway, Darren Merritt says, I believe Ukraine has more of an obligation to protect its citizens than holding elections. It's really interesting. So there are competing rights. There are no, if you know me and my philosophical ruminations, you will know that I am what's called a conceptual nominalist. A conceptual nominalist is someone who believes that abstract ideas don't exist out there. If they exist anywhere, they exist in our heads. And when we agree with each other on, say, what the definition of words mean, we write dictionaries, and what the definition of ideas mean, then we write encyclopedias. But these are consensus documents that exist on us agreeing on abstract ideas in our heads that we then codify into a document. It's exactly how the Constitution works and how the Bill of Rights works. It's just a consensus document, and the Bill of Rights is just a document of a bunch of people agreeing on stuff. People think it's more sacrosanct than it is. It's just like it's an agreement among a bunch of people that has been amended a whole bunch of times because they didn't get it right first time. And you could argue it still needs some serious amendments, but amending it because of how it is enforced, if you like, and enacted means you have to. It's very difficult to amend it, but it can be done. But these ideas are out there. Sorry, these ideas are in here. They're not out there. And so when we have competing rights, there isn't an answer that's out there because rights don't exist. Human rights don't exist. Asterisks. They do exist. They do exist because we construct them, and hopefully we agree on them. But they don't exist out there. And what that means is that, and even if they did exist out there, there's something called an epistemic barrier, or I call an epistemic barrier, which means that if they do exist out there, how do I know what the correct rights are? How I still have to do the thinking myself. So it still comes down to they exist in here, right? Okay, so you will get rights that compete against each other. So in the US, people talk about inalienable rights. There are no inalienable rights. There are rights that are written down and enforced by law, and they can get changed. And there you go. And so we have to do philosophical arguments to get to some kind of agreement. But you will get like the right to bear arms against the right to do this, against the right to do that, against the right to do this. And some of those rights actually come up against each other. And the problem is because they don't exist out there, they exist in here, then we have to go, oh my goodness, well, this right, I think this right is more important than this right, and therefore it trumps this right. So when they do come up against each other, this right prevails because of my personal beliefs about that. But someone else might say, well, actually, I think this right's more important. And the problem is there is no objective answer to that. There are subjective answers, or there are answers that require a lot of unpicking with philosophical debate. Sorry to go down a philosophical rabbit hole with that, but you have here an obligation to protect citizens and an obligation to hold elections, and those obligations defer to kind of what you think are, well, these are moral obligations. So an obligation would be a moral obligation. So that exists in here. And you will get some people, so my interlocutor on the threads might say it's much more important that Ukraine holds those elections, and that's the obligation. He pretty much said that. He says that if they don't do that, then it's not a country I want to be partnered with. Whereas I go, I think it's probably more important that they keep their population safe for the time being, so that we don't have large-scale deaths and safety issues in holding an election. So, like, what's the more important moral obligation here? The safety or holding an election? And of course, there's no answer there. There's no objective answer there. We have to argue that amongst ourselves. And even like personally, I'll have those arguments in my head. So anyway, it just made me go down that rabbit hole. Thanks for that, Darren. You probably didn't really want to hear all that waffle. Cheryl says, how would the Avastal prisoners be able to vote? Interesting point. And of course, when you do have elections, you try and allow for as many people to vote as possible, but it's not always possible, right? So people live abroad, people are put in prison. Do you give prisoners the right to vote? Which is, an interesting debate that goes on in the US and oh my goodness, I was going to go down the 13th there. If you want to watch a really interesting documentary, watch the 13th on Netflix about whether there was a move to imprison people to invalidate them from voting. So when you made the drug laws not a mental health issue or a health issue, but made it a criminal issue, it means that if you do drugs, we can put you in prison rather than take you to hospital. And by making that illegal, we can then invalidate a whole section of society from voting. And if that's overwhelmingly a certain section of society, then that's going to be beneficial to us. So anyway, very interesting way of looking at incarceration and voting. Anyway, yeah, there are always going to be issues with any country in peacetime, and being able to get everyone, or the most amount of people, the maximum amount of people to vote. So no matter whether you're at war or not, there are always going to be some people that unfortunately you just can't get round to. You could spend $1 gazillion trying to get an extra 1,000 people to vote, and you're trying to work out whether that's worth doing. Is that $1 gazillion better spent elsewhere, etc., etc.? Anyway, that's another rabbit hole you're making me go down. Stop it. Mark Gould, thank you. Gould, sorry. Thank you so much, Mark. That's an incredibly generous super sticker there, and I really do appreciate that support. It allows me to keep going. It allows me to spend my time making really crap PowerPoint presentations and talking to you about the arguments for and against elections in Ukraine. But thank you, Mark. Really appreciated that. And Kevin Forst, who's such a great supporter of the channel, has gifted 5 ATP Geopolitics memberships. Cheers, mate. Ex-Penguin 95 said, Speaker of the House, the US House of Representatives, Mike Johnson, has just supported the possibility of Ukraine striking Russia with American weapons. Ooh. Oh, see, this is what happens when you do crappy PowerPoint presentations and start creating them and spend an hour and a half doing that. You don't know what's going on. Oh, that sounds amazing. I just got shivered down my spine. Thank you for that. Fingers crossed. That might be the best thing Mike Johnson's ever done and said. Right. Gifted 5 ATP Geopolitics memberships, Mary M. Thank you for your support. That's really, really generous of you. Now, Talking Bloke says, would it be a good idea to have a digital, non-binding referenda on the question, perhaps? I don't quite know what you mean by this, but if you mean digital as in like literally like technologically digital as in have it online, I am amazed that in the UK all my banking's online, and I've got all my money that I own is digitally controlled, and yet I'm not allowed to digitally vote. Now, I know there are security issues, etc., but my goodness, if you want to increase a voter turnout, making it as easy to vote as possible. I mean, mail-in votes, I'm a massive fan of that. Just anyone that puts up obstacles to voting is doing it because it's to their benefit to do it and not for the benefit of democracy, is my opinion. So if you're saying we should not have mail-in vote ballots, it's because you know that most people that mail in are people that vote for the party other than the one you want to vote for generally. Like, there are some security issues and you should make it as obviously as secure as possible, but my goodness, we should just be making it as easy as well as secure as possible to vote. We need to be enfranchising people, not disenfranchising them, and that really is a bugbear of mine. Non-binding referenda on the question, I don't so I presume your question here is, should they put the question to the people in a, which they have done. There's been a poll done, right? And that 81% thinks they shouldn't have an election, but should it be kind of more official? Let's get to having not just a telephone survey. I want as many people in the country to kind of digitally vote as possible, or register your opinion in this survey, and then we'll see if you are happy with not having an election, or you want an election. And I suppose it's just slightly more robust than just a telephone survey, which is what the previous one was. So if that's what you're suggesting, that's a good idea. Johnny Christensen, thanks, mate. Really appreciate your support there. Some Danish love. And that's pretty much that. I don't have anything else particularly to say, although Rick from the Netherlands does. In the Netherlands, it's front page news that Russia is planning to claim parts of the Baltic Sea, redrawing the sea borders. Is this known by more? Now, this is something I'm yet to talk about in my geopolitics video that I haven't done yet. So the Russians have unilaterally decided they're going to help themselves to some Baltic waters, It's interesting because this is a NATO country. So if you walked up to a NATO country and said, as Russia, I'm going to help myself to your land, you'd be like, Article 5, thank you very much. You've invaded our land and claiming it yours. Why is sea area any different? Anyway, this has been touted, but I have a feeling it's disappeared off the Duma list of things that they were going to enact or talk about or whatever. So I don't know whether this was going to happen, and then Russia realized that it was an absolutely insane idea, and so they've reneged on that. But this is certainly a huge talking point, and rightly so, because my opinion would be that would be a trigger for Article 5. I can't see why the sea is any different from it's an international border, right? But again, this is Russia trying to push the boundaries here, push the envelope. Right. I don't know. Thank you very much for your very kind words. Thank you very much to Christopher here. Says great video. It's ironic how the fascists and authoritarians are the ones who are the most critical of Ukraine for not holding elections. What a great point there. What a really good point. I often think that people who talk about freedoms and libertarians are the ones that often want to stop people controlling bodily autonomy, or don't like it when people say things that they don't like. And here it's people who are possibly the least democratic have an issue with Ukraine not holding elections. And of course, it's just complete opportunism there. So yeah, that's a really, really good point there, as Kevin agrees. So hey, we can all agree on that. So thank you very much. Really appreciate that. If there are no more questions, and I know that JR has been fielding those questions, I really appreciate that. I'm going to have the last swig of my now very cold tea, which is not nice. I don't like it, but I feel I have to do it. Oh, that is cold. Yes. I thank you so much. Take care, everybody. And I'm going to get on and do a oh my goodness, Matt Bishop is still here. I almost contacted Matt to see if he wanted to be on this live, but I thought he's clearly going to be asleep because he's in Australia. And so I didn't. And I really should have done, because it's been too long, Matt. So I'm so sorry about that. So yeah, please go back to regular AGB geopolitics videos. Matt, go on quickly. Get your question in. You have one more question. Here it comes, Matt. So hopefully this video, even though I'm blathering on at the end here, hopefully this will be a slightly evergreen video that will be able to stay as one that provides information for people, whether it's now or 3 weeks time or 3 months time. It'll still be relevant. It's got all of those points that I think it's fairly clear that the arguments against holding an election overwhelm those that argue for holding an election. Of course, there's not to say that there aren't good reasons for holding an election. It would be wonderful if you could, but I just don't think it's practically possible, and it would be incredibly diversionary and distractive for Ukraine. I'm not sure that's a word, but okay, that really is it. I don't think Matt's got the question coming in, unless 5 more seconds, Matt. No. Okay. Anyway, that's enough from me. Thank you very much, everyone. I'll close it down. Matt, you're going to have to ask me in my next live stream. It's gone blank. Damn it, Matt. You've just kept me blathering. That's just not fair. Okay, take care, everyone. See you soon. Really appreciate your support. And thanks particularly to Mark Gould and all the others who supported the stream. Take care, everybody. Speak to you soon. And thanks, JR.